Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at the last ditch, No. 4 Mark I Lee Enfield, which, well, last ditch for Great Britain really kind of meant early in the war, 1941, 1942, because that's when the UK was at their most precarious situation, particularly after Dunkirk. They had lost a tremendous amount of ordnance. The BEF had to be evacuated from the continent. It was looking like Britain was the last man standing in the war on the Western Front. And it was at this time that rifle production was really essential, and standards kind of dropped in terms of quality, and a lot of substitutions started being investigated and implemented by the British military in construction of their No. 4 rifles. They became very much more concerned about getting guns that would shoot, and not really caring quite so much about how they looked. So for most countries where we typically think of a last-ditch rifle, like Germany or Japan, this would come at the very end of the war. For Britain, it comes fairly early. So let's go ahead and take a look at this guy up close, because this is a really good example of about the bottom of the barrel when it came to British production. And after this, by 1943, quality and fit and finish would start to pick back up as things looked a little bit less tenuous for the British. So let's take a closer look. The production changes involved in this kind of bottom of the barrel version of the Lee Enfield were all based on reducing machine time and avoiding bottlenecks in the production process. So as parts became identified as particularly difficult to acquire or slower to acquire than any other part, that would start to draw attention as how can we simplify this? How can we pick up production of this element and thus increase overall rifle production? And a couple specific parts stand out. One of them, of course, is the rear sight. So here is an example of a very early summer of 1941 production rifle with its very nice, fancy, complex, click-adjustable micrometer rear sight. That was a problem. That took a lot of time to make. It was difficult to get in sufficient numbers from subcontractors, and so they went to the Mark II rear sight, which is drastically simplified. It is just a two-position flip aperture. You can easily see how much cheaper and quicker that flip sight would have been to make. Now, after the war, or even later in the war, a lot of these would start to be adapted back, replaced with better styles of rear sight. And in fact, I have a whole separate video on the subsequent changes of rear sights that the British made, because they went from this to a sort of quasi-micrometer sight that was made of stamped components. You can check that video for all of those details. But at the worst of times, they went to this two-position flip sight. Now, the original rifles had this kind of fancy button-shaped or mushroom-shaped cocking piece. That would also be very quickly replaced with a squared off piece that has these three grooves cut in it. That was way faster and simpler to make. You could cut a lot of machine operations out of it, and it worked just as well. Those little grooves give you about as much ability to manually recock this as the flange on the early version. Also, almost immediately, this sort of fancy contoured front sight protector went away, and it was replaced by a much simplified version that was functionally no different. You can see here that this piece simply has a flat profile instead of having this divot and this nice little ridge at the top. There's no reason to need this. And so this was a pretty obvious simplification that was put into use. Not all of these changes were permanent. A lot of them would be reversed over the course of the war. One of the very short-term changes that was tried and ultimately not kept was an even more simplified cocking piece where they got rid of the little grasping grooves in it. This is a little harder to actually manually recock or to safely lower if you're going to try to do that. And they would go back to cutting the grooves in it. There was one even simpler version that I don't have an example here to show you, where they very briefly got rid of the half-cock safety notch in this cocking piece. So you can see there are two positions in that. And the idea is if you start to pull it back and slip, it can only fall to that safety notch. And if you slip before you get to the safety notch, there's not enough energy in this to fire a cartridge if it's chambered. So getting rid of the half-cock notch here was seen as a a very real safety hazard, and largely for that reason, that change was abandoned and they went back to actually having it, as this one does. Aluminum butt plates were used as well as gunmetal ones, looks like bronze or brass, without, as far as I can tell, all that much rhyme or reason. It was simply a matter of both styles, both materials were acceptable, and whatever was available in production in the parts bin got used. So you'll see both materials for the butt plate. Not surprisingly, one of the other components that was particularly expensive and time-consuming to manufacture was the barrel. And so barrels became a source of supply limitations. Now, the original Lee Enfield No. 4 was spec'd out with a 5-groove barrel, like this one. And these are individually cut grooves. And so it was decided, someone realized, hey, if maybe we don't need quite as many rifling grooves, let's see if we could get away with fewer and still not lose any substantial amount of accuracy. And so really early on in May of 1941, they actually approved a 2-groove barrel. Testing showed that 2 grooves was actually just as accurate as 5. And so a great many Lee Enfields were made with simple 2-groove barrels that were a lot quicker to make. And you can see in this one, there's only those 2 grooves. And that actually spun the projectile just as reliably and just as well and gave just as good of accuracy as the original 5-groove barrels. Later on, a 3-groove barrel would actually be tested and approved as well, but as far as I can tell, it was never actually put into production by anybody. It was acceptable as an alternative should a factory want to use it, but nobody did. If we take a look at the receiver of this is a July of 1942 production gun. You can see it's really quite crude finishing. So tons of tool marks left here. The weld where the top piece of the receiver bridge there has been fixed in place is crude and really still very obvious. As a comparison, this one up top is our very early production Maltby rifle, made in the summer, late summer, early fall of 1941. This is summer of 1942, and you can see this is nice and cleanly finished across here, and this kind of looks like crap. The attachment, the weld mark here this is much cleaner than on the 1942 gun. And when we go down to take a look at the markings on the receiver socket, man, they're really quite crude. So the England there was added when this rifle was imported into the US as a legal requirement, but ROF is Royal Ordnance Fazakerley, which is the factory that made the gun. It is dated here 7/42. Individual hand stamps, they're all kind of askew. The serial number is very crude looking. This is typical. This is what the guns looked like when they were being produced in the middle of 1942. Even looking at the stock here, you can see a lot more, less attention paid to fit and perfect finish of the stock carving. Now, the bolt removal method for the number 4 is an area that was also changed. So in order to take the bolt out, we open it and we're going to pull the bolt back to about here and then depress this little spring-loaded latch. Then I can bring the bolt the rest of the way back, lift up the bolt head, and pull the bolt out. By the way, if you have the original sight, you have to lift the sight up to get the bolt out. But what we have here is just this little groove in the base of the bolt head that runs in a channel here in the receiver, and the channel continues into this little spring clip. So that's the purpose there. Well, of all things, these turned out to be a difficult part to source well, and it's not entirely clear to me why, but as a result, the British tested and developed and approved a replacement method, and this would become known as the No. 4 Mark I star. So this is really the only modification to the No. 4 that was substantial enough to be given a whole new designation for the rifle. All of these other changes, like the sights and the cocking piece, the individual parts were given new mark numbers, but the rifle as a whole did not change its designation. Now, having said that, the British factories, Maltby and BSA and Fazakerley, never actually implemented this change, we see it primarily, or really exclusively, in American and Canadian production. So production at Savage and production at Long Branch. And I have an example here to show you. So this is a Savage gun. It's marked US property, not because the US ever actually used it, but because in order to legally qualify for Lend-Lease, it had to be American. It had to be American government property. So the guns were manufactured, marked US property, and immediately sent to the UK. So you'll notice that there is no little spring latch here. Instead, on these, on the Mark I stars, this rail has been slightly cut away right here. So for disassembly, we pull the bolt back to just that spot, and then get it just in the right place. There we go. And then the bolt head can be lifted up out of its track right there. And the opening in that track is narrow enough that this actually doesn't come out under normal use. They had some issues with the original trials where if this was cut a little too large or if it got worn, you could get the bolt head, popping open during cycling. But they were able to get the clearances and tolerances of this cut set such that it really wasn't a problem in practice. Then you can just pull the bolt out the back of the rifle. So that's the number 4 Mark I star, which was produced in the US and Canada, but not in the UK. Well, mostly not in the UK. There was actually a small batch in 1944 manufactured at Maltby, and you can see this is a 1944 dated gun, that they they goofed, and they marked a batch of them, Mark I star, despite the fact that it has the standard Mark I bolt removal section. So this is one of those examples of a really interesting little subvariant, really known only to some pretty high-end collectors, where, they accidental mismarking. This is kind of like actually the German STG-45 magazines, which were not made for the STG-45. They were a mistake at one of the Czech factories, thinking that they would be iterating the number of the magazine marking every year. One of the other production choke points for the British, and they realized this before the war even started, was wooden furniture. So in order to be properly used, wood for rifle stock has to be dried, and that's a time-consuming process. So it didn't take very long before the UK was completely out of good, slow, naturally dried French walnut to use for rifle stocks. So where the Germans, when faced with a problem like this, went to use of laminated stocks, and the British actually tested a laminated stock. For whatever reason, they didn't like it. I think it's because their alternatives were actually simpler and more effective for them. We'll touch on that in just a moment. They also tested a sheet metal only stock, which would have functioned okay, but they realized it's going to get really cold in the cold and really hot in the hot, and really, okay, this isn't the best way to go. What they ended up doing was experimenting with kiln drying, basically accelerating the drying process, and they started to use a lot of alternative woods, primarily birch and beech, in place of the original specified walnut. And so that is how the British got around the problem of how do we get wood for rifle stocks. They were able to develop a kiln drying system that was acceptable, although this would lead to some issues, which we'll get to in the subsequent video about the Mark II, the number 4 Mark II rifle. So the Germans used laminated wood. The British went to kiln-dried birch and beech. Now, the end of World War II isn't the end of the number 4 Lee Enfield story. So first off, there would be development and adoption and production of the number 5 carbine, which we'll cover in a separate video. And then the number 4 would actually continue in production. The number 5 would not become a standard universal rifle. In fact, the number 4 would continue in production after the number 5 had ceased into the 1950s. So that would be accompanied by a few further upgrades, and we'll cover that in a separate video as well. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. I think it's really cool to take a look at a gun that is the last-ditch British rifle. We don't normally think of the British having a last-ditch Lee Enfield, but this is pretty much as close as it gets to it. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.